The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Fuse have lined up another giveaway, open to anyone who switches their electricity supplier to Fuse.
All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics when you sign up.
And this time we're putting some merch bundles together for them. I'm thinking hoodies, sweatshirts, hats. If you came to see us on tour, you might have seen some of it already.
But aside from the prizes, well worth considering switching to Fuse. Their tariffs are cheaper than any of the big six competitors, so you'll still be saving money even though the price cap has gone up.
And the great thing is, Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables, which means they're planning for a clean energy future.
It will take you just 3 minutes to download the app and sign up. Fuse will also handle everything with your old supplier, so you won't have to lift a finger.
So download the Fuse app now and use referral code POLITICS after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics, question time with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
Now, Rory, here's a really big issue and a really big question. Freddie Hulston, is Keir Starmer right not to put pressure on Labour MPs to vote in favour of the assisted dying bill? It's hard to see why anyone would want to deny a person a dignified death. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a contradiction there in the question, isn't it? If it's genuinely true that it's hard to see why anyone would disagree, why do you need to have a three-line whip? Why not let MPs vote on their conscience and vote independently? That's something that reminds me. I often got that from constituents. I don't want to be mean to the person asking the question, but there's a weird combination of two things happening there. On the one hand, somebody believing that there's an obvious moral answer, and on the other hand, trying to rely on party whips and three-line whips to force MPs to vote in a particular direction that they agree on.
The reason why I think it's right that it's a free vote is because we talk about issues of conscience. I think this is something where people should be allowed, entitled to really think deeply about it and then come to their own view. Instinctively, I am in favour of the bill. I think Kim Ledbetter, who is the MP who's brought this forward as a private member's bill, and people remember she became an MP on the back of her sister Jo Cox being murdered, and she replaced her. I know Kim well. I think she's a terrific woman. I think she's a very, very, really good person. And I think she comes at this from that perspective of saying that, as we get older, as illness becomes more complicated, as people have to sometimes spend the last few years of their lives in absolute abject pain and misery, etc., that people should be entitled to end their own lives without that being called as it were, suicide. But what was interesting, we're recording this on Tuesday morning, and I did the Today programme this morning, and I was on at 8:20. So they, as ever, they call you up early and you sort of listen to the programme beforehand. And the item before me was Kim talking about the safeguards that are included in the bill, which are very considerable. 2 doctors, a judge having the final decision, right to appeal, etc., etc. So I felt the safeguards were very, very strong. And I listened to her and I nodded along and I thought, yeah, she's absolutely right and I hope she wins. And then on comes Ed Davey, Liberal Democrat leader, speaking in a personal capacity. And he made a very interesting argument about whether people who were feeling weak, feeling vulnerable, feeling old, feeling ill, whether they would feel psychologically pressured to end their lives earlier than actually deep down they wanted to, and whether they might not even raise that. And I thought, yeah, interesting. And that's why I thought, and he then went on to say that I think that this is one of those issues that really does need a careful, thoughtful debate. And I hope that when it comes before Parliament in the next couple of weeks, that's what we get. As I say, instinctively, I back Kim Ledbetter, and I think it's the right thing to do. But I recognise that there are lots of arguments and lots of real concerns, and Parliament is the place where they should be thrashed out.
I think this is somewhere where, again, we will disagree agreeably. I'm more sceptical about this.
Joey McCarthy, what did you think of Macron and Starmer riding a military vehicle, no, it wasn't a tank, through the streets of Paris? Will we be seeing them on the We Have Ways podcast in the near future? I thought it was really interesting. So Keir Starmer became the first British Prime Minister since Churchill to have the honour, and that's how the French very much see it. This is an honour, We're inviting you as a fellow world leader to come and share in this amazing event. Obviously, the British-French ties and military ties are very, very strong. But I think it was a very deliberate decision by Macron. If you remember, one of the first things he did when Trump was elected first time around was to give him that honour. And of course, Trump loved all that. Now, Macron is in a difficult position politically. He's in a second term and he can't do a third term. He had that snap election that you advised him against, which ended up with the government kind of in crisis. Michel Barnier has calmed things down. But at the same time, Macron is not as powerful a figure in Europe as he was. But he is still the president of France. He still passionately believes, we talked about this last week, that amazing speech he made at that meeting of European leaders after Trump was elected. Do we want to write history or do we just want to read history? And I think this is him saying, look, I didn't think Brexit was a good idea for you, and I thought it was a bad idea for Europe. And I hope that you'll sort of think about more sensible relations. Meanwhile, we have to be serious about European foreign and defence policy. And I think having Keir Starmer there was very much part of that messaging to the world, which I think is a very important message.
Macron's really leaning into, obviously, this more confident, aggressive language. He gave this speech in which he said that Europe is in danger of becoming the world's herbivore following Trump's re-election. And it's going to be eaten by the carnivores. So he obviously has been pushing this vision of Macron really becoming a bloc independent from China and the United States in everything from defense and security to, I guess, AI and tech. Is that something that you can see Starmer wanting to get behind, or is Starmer's personality more sort of, as you'd put it, more pragmatic, less utopian, more tentative, about less likely to buy into kind of grand French dreams?
Well, I think we'd be wrong to see it as a grand French dream. I think it's Macron, albeit from a more limited position of power than he had maybe in his first term or in the start of his second term. I think he's just telling a few home truths about the nature of power in the world. And we talked in the main podcast about Germany. So Trump is going to be taking office as Germany will be in the middle of an election because the current German government has not been able to hold a coalition together. That's pretty chaotic. It will be happening at a time when, if you read the opinion polls, Marine Le Pen, without doing very much, is kind of, pretty much on the march. It will be doing so at a time when in Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, you've had the rise of the far right. And also even within Scandinavia, we've seen within the Swedish government, the fact that the True Democrats are now pretty powerful there, and not to mention the Netherlands and so forth. So, I think Macron's just telling a few home truths, both about the nature of European politics, but also about the nature of European power. And of course, from the British perspective, Macron's there clearly wanting Britain to be part of this debate, but we're doing so from outside the European Union. And of course, the Brexiteers are saying, well, this is fantastic because we'll be able to do a trade deal with America. I mean, that's for the birds right now. It's for the birds.
Do you think that sort of ideologically, personality terms, Starmer is up for an exciting, bold new vision of Europe's role in defense and security in the world? I mean, we had a question here, which I thought was quite interesting on this. Casimira Headley Walker, as a UK voter who resents having to care about the American elections more than others, such as the German ones, and we've definitely done quite a lot in the German elections recently, I was wondering if there's a way to reshape the international order away from America. Is this possible? Would a space left by American dominance just be filled by another national strongman? Now, before we get into the details of Casimira's question, which I think is a really good one, what do you think that Starmer's instincts is when is he somebody who sympathizes with Macron's home truths, or would he fall into the category of the slightly cynical friends that I have in Germany who think, oh, well, this is Macron being a bit grandiose and it's not really very realistic?
Well, I think it's not a question of it being realistic. I think if we don't take that approach, we've got real problems, because from the British perspective, we are, whether we like it or not, we are out on our own. The special relationship, it was interesting when we did the podcast from New York, Anthony Scaramucci was very much saying, yes, it's real. And, the new incoming administration will see Britain as the most important relationship. I'm not sure about that. I'm not convinced of that. And so at some point, I think Keir Starmer is going to have to make a pretty big choice. Well, no, he's going to have to straddle both. He's going to have to try to develop closer relations, economic and political, with the European Union, at the same time as trying to maximize the possibilities of the fact that we do have historically this very close relationship with the United States. And of course, he does it with a very mercurial president coming in. But if you look at the numbers, Rory, on just to take trade, so take imports, 55% European Union, 10% United States, 10% China, 26% rest of the world. Our exports, 47% European Union, 15% United States, 6% China, 32% the rest of the world. So what Trump does, because he's the 300-pound gorilla, is he comes in and makes people think, right, the decisions all have to be about Trump. But if as a result of that, we decide, right, well, let's just put all our effort into getting much, much closer to America at the expense of a relationship with the European Union, I think that would be a terrible mistake.
It's also, as we've discussed before, the world has changed so much even since the Brexit vote, because the Brexit vote happened at a moment where the Brexiteers could still be relatively optimistic about global free trade. You know, it was the very end of the period where it felt as though free trade was expanding in the world. But that year, of course, Trump was elected, and that was the beginning of a move towards protectionism. So Trump put up big tariff barriers. Biden kept them in place. Global trade has now halved. So having been growing at about twice the rate of global GDP, it's now running at about that trend rate. So we're now in a world in which it's completely unrealistic for Britain to fantasize about a world of new trade deals. In fact, many people are very worried in the US that Trump, who basically believes tariffs are the answer to everything, is going to put not just 60% tariffs against Chinese goods, but 20% standard tariffs against all goods from everywhere else in the world. That would include the United Kingdom. And so there's that. And then there's the security story, which is that the fantasies that David Davis and Michael Gove and others had about being able to do trade with China, of course, don't make any sense in a world in which we're very aware that Xi Jinping is a strategic rival, and where we've seen with Russia, Ukraine, the dangers of being very open to economies that can get us into military entanglements. So the pressure to push back towards a customs union with Europe is much, much stronger than it would have been 8 years ago.
I'd have thought so. And also, if you think, you talked in the main podcast about, we need big goals and big targets and what have you. And I was saying, yes, we do. And sometimes they're necessary, but also they can lead to disappointment. So there you had Brexit, and you had Johnson and Gove and Davis and the rest of them saying, these trade deals are going to fall out of the sky. We're going to have this amazing deal with America. It hasn't happened. It was probably never going to happen. And if it happened, if the UK government now said, right, the big goal, we're going to try and get some sort of massive, fantastic singing and dancing American trade deal. I mean, just think about the effort that you've got to go into to do that, dealing with the Trump administration. So I think we've got to be careful about not falling into this trap of, because Trump has been elected and because, he is such a sort of high profile, forceful figure in the world, that somehow we have to shape our foreign and economic policy around his arrival. We don't. And if we do it, that's why I thought it was, I think Keir Starmer would have thought carefully about, oh my God, Trump's just been elected. Do I really want to be seen riding down the Champs-Élysées with Macron? Well, I'm glad that he decided the answer to that was yes. And one other point, Rory, I was on the Sophie Ridge programme on Sky, and Sam Coates, the Sky political reporter, he was doing a thing about how much time Keir Starmer was spending abroad. He listed all the visits that he's done, and he was in Samoa for the CHOGM. He was in Paris, and now he's in Baku for COP. I think now look, there is always a danger with prime ministers that you discover, as and I discovered this, to be honest, is that sometimes the foreign policy side of stuff is more interesting, and there's a danger that you take your eye off the ball. But I think at the moment, in this period of history and of all the challenges that we're facing as a country that has, in my view, made the catastrophic decision to leave the European Union, this foreign policy stuff and the relations that our leaders develop, they really, really matter to the stuff we need to do domestically.
We had a question from Jane Abbott, which I think just to finish off this whole question raised by Casimir about what happens to the world as the US leaves. She asks what Trump's election means for Saudi and Iran. And I think let's just touch on that very quickly, because you can see that Saudi has kept going with an Iran deal. And it looks like the deal, it's still pretty shadowy, but looks like the deal will be that the Iranians are supposed to stop their backing for the Houthis in Yemen. And in return, the Saudis are going to stop backing some of the insurgents in the Arab areas of Iran. And this is presumably because there are two possible options that places like Saudi face towards Iran. One of them was to say, Iran is an existential threat, so we're going to line up with the US and Israel as our protectors against Iran. The other view is maybe we need a détente with Iran, and that actually the best way of guaranteeing our security is to have better relations with Iran. And the fact that Iran proved in its missile exchanges with Israel to be less powerful than people anticipated maybe means that Saudi can be a bit more confident about balancing itself towards Iran. And that's going to put it in an interesting position with Trump, because I think we've assumed, because Jared Kushner and Trump's family have made a lot of money in UAE and Saudi, and that he seemed to have a good relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, and Mohammed bin Zayed in UAE. That's going to continue forever. I'm not sure that's true. I think we could be getting into a world where, as Saudi and UAE become increasingly wealthy and confident, they're going to increasingly show their independence, not just from the US, but even from a new Trump administration.
Well, listen, I think you're right that this is not as straightforward as maybe we might think. I think that we should come back to this and do a big thing on what Trump relations with some of those big powers in that region will be. I think we should come back to that on the main podcast sometime. There's a question here, Rory, that I'm gagging to ask. Should there be a limit on the number of former prime ministers who can attend Armistice Day? And I got a message while I was watching the Senate events on Sunday. I got a message from a friend of mine who's in the Special Forces, and he said, and it just said, WTF. Look at the state of them. This when they had the whole sort of the lineup of. So let's just go through. Keir Starmer's the Prime Minister, and then you've got John Major. I'm going from right to left as they lined up. John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, who looks ever more like Michael Fabricant, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. So that is, and somebody pointed out that we had 24 prime years for 4 prime ministers, and then 6 prime ministers in 8 years. And there's a line down the man that you say is looking more and more like Jim Callaghan, namely David Cameron. And the dividing line does seem to be does seem to be Brexit. So yeah, look, I think it's absolutely absurd that Johnson, who left in disgrace, was Richard Nixon, when Richard Nixon fell from grace, was he then involved in all the big sort of national events? Don't know. And Liz Truss, Roy, my favourite tweet of the week, somebody pointed out that if Liz Truss lives to 96, she will spend more days at the cenotaph than she spent as Prime Minister in Downing Street. How's about that?
That's pretty good. That's good stuff. Now, here's a niche question which is going to test you, Alastair. Maybe a trick question. Thelma Montez, can you please discuss what's going on in Equatorial Guinea, Alastair? No free press means there's limited reporting, but it looks like a sex tape scandal could be sabotaging Mr. Ngonga's chance of the presidency. What are your thoughts?
Well, you knew that I knew about this because I sent you a link to a report about it and said, my God, as sex scandals go, this is something else. So, Equatorial Guinea. Have you ever been to Equatorial Guinea?
I've never been to Equatorial Guinea. I really wanted to go when I was Africa Minister. It's ex-Spanish Guinea. It's 1.7 million people, very, very oil rich, massively corrupt. But yes, it's somewhere I don't think actually the British government has an embassy. So they tended to try to send me places we had diplomatic representation.
Essentially, what this story is about is I don't quite. It is very, very hard to get your head around this. So there is, as you said, there's no real free press, but there is social media, and hundreds, several hundred videos have been leaked on social media, and they're sort of flooding. Everybody's sharing them with each other. And these are videos of a guy whose nickname is Bello, because he's apparently quite good looking. His name is Baltazar Ibang Ngonga, and it's him having sex with different women in his office and elsewhere. And a lot of these women are the wives of people who are already in the government. So there's a lot of I suspect, a lot of family repair work going on right now. But the reason this guy Ngonga, he's a nephew of the current president, who's a guy called Teodoro Obiang Nguema.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I didn't know his name until I looked it up, because Equatorial Guinea is a country that I've never been to and I don't know that much about. But he's 82 years old, and he's, as you say, presiding over a pretty corrupt country with a very small, incredibly wealthy elite, and lots of the people who live there actually living in poverty. There's been a lot of big scandals, including one of the president's sons, who's now the vice president. He once he paid $250,000 for a glove that was encrusted with crystals that previously belonged to Michael Jackson. There's no opposition. Activists tend to get chucked in jail.
Just quickly, a little fact on him. He's the second longest consecutively serving current non-royal national leader in the world, behind Cameroon's Paul Biya. So he's been basically the president of Equatorial Guinea since 1982, right the way through to 2024.
Well, this guy, Mr. Ngonga, seems to have a certain charm for the ladies, is all I can put it. But bloody hell, you talk about government splits. When these guys see their wives, and it includes some of the guys who run the army, their wives. So anyway, it seems that this guy Ngonga fancies himself as taking over as president.
Yeah.
So it's clearly. But what I don't know is who took the videos, whether he took the videos.
The allegation is that he took the videos himself, and he's been campaigning under the name of Bello, or the good-looking one. So maybe he sort of thought this was whether he was taking the videos for private consumption, or whether he thought it'd help them. One small edge on this. Sarah Lapido has done an incredible interview, if you people have time, with the niece of the current president of Equatorial Guinea, whose father, Francisco Macias, was the first president of Equatorial Guinea. And her story is incredible. So she's a young Guinean woman whose father was the first president, and at the age of 7 was sent off to school in North Korea, in Pyongyang, and went off to an elite school where Kim Il-sung would check up with her on the telephone from time to time. While she was there, Obiang, the current president of Equatorial Guinea, killed her father, who was accused of incredible human rights abuses. She then grew up in North Korea before eventually moving to Spain, and she's had a lot of very, very difficult low-income jobs around the world, and has now published a book called Black Girl from Pyongyang. So Sarah Lapido's interview, I think, is worth listening to, but it's also an incredible insight into a woman whose life is sort of beyond imagining. To be a president's daughter, brought up in a boarding school in Pyongyang, this very close relationship. I mean, probably the best insight into the North Korean regime that I've come across, but now on a rather unfortunate journey to try to clear her father's name, the dictatorial uncle who was the previous president of Equatorial Guinea. So people who want to pick up on that, that the podcast is called Transition on the Wire.
I mean, I think there's definitely a movie in the sex tapes, and I think the story you just told is a movie as well.
Yeah, I think Equatorial Guinea could be a massive series of movies.
I think it could. Talking movies, by the way, I went to see Blitz this week.
Oh, yes?
It's absolutely fantastic.
Oh, go on, tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it's about the Blitz. It's about Saoirse Ronan, the Irish actress who's playing a Cockney mum with a mixed-race son. The son is a young boy played by a young actor called Elliot Hefferman, who's absolutely amazing. Paul Weller, musician. He's the granddad, sort of tinkling away at the piano. So it's about the Blitz, and it's honestly it's a Steve McQueen film, and it's one of his best, I think.
Oh, brilliant. Well, here's my little cultural plug. I went to see the Silk Road exhibition at the British Museum, and that is amazing because it suddenly reveals that Anglo-Saxon Britain, famously the Dark Ages after the Romans left, when we really seemed to be a pretty cold island cut off from the world, had far more contacts with Central Asia. There's a coin of Offa, who built Offa's Dyke, the border with Wales, which is an Arab coin that says Allah la illallah Muhammad Rasulallah, so there's no God but God, Muhammad's his prophet. And on the other side, it says Offa Rex. And then there's a Sasanian bowl made from Persian silver found in a church right up on the Scottish border, and fragments of Chinese silk from treasuries in Europe in the late 8th century. So unbelievable. And they've brought, I'm sort of slightly resentful of this, I trekked halfway across Central Asia to see this incredible mural in a relatively remote part of southern Uzbekistan, which has now been moved wholesale to the British Museum. So you can turn up and see it there, and it appears to represent Korean ambassadors turning up in a Central Asian court.
Very, very good. We're going to stick on culture for a bit.
Yeah, go on then.
I'm reading a brilliant book at the moment by a Bloomberg journalist called Stephanie Baker, called "Punishing Putin."
Oh yes.
It's about all the sanctions that came on the Russian oligarchs and so forth, and it just underlines, when we talk about the deal that you might do with Ukraine, unpicking a lot of this stuff, I think, will be a big part of that as well. Anyway, we're talking too much and not having enough questions here, Rory.
Okay, well, Gabriella Nugent, then, it's a good question for you. I find Rory and Alastair's view of Australia rather starry-eyed. Where were the mentions of populism? You only look at the recent Indigenous vote to see the spread of populism, the lies disseminated by the Murdoch newspapers. The levels of multiculturalism and acceptance seen in the United Kingdom are nowhere to be found in Australia. What are your thoughts? Well, I'm not sure about that. I think Australia, in a way, was lucky.
Oh, I think she's got a point. I think we asked. Look, I am definitely starry-eyed about Australia.
Go on.
I always have been. But I do think the Voice referendum defeat indicated a kind of underlying failure, refusal to settle some of their big historical questions. I think there is quite a lot of racism and sexism around in Australia. But I love going to Australia and I love the place. And I know, Rory, you have become, if anything, even more starry-eyed than me, based upon your.
Well, so let me try my Australia theory on you and tell me where I'm missing it. So one of my ideas is that compulsory voting means that there's less populism, and that may also be, and this is an uncomfortable thing to talk about in the future, that actually their very strict controls on illegal immigration have also meant that far-right populists haven't got away, and maybe also the fact that Pauline Hanson, who some listeners will have heard of, turned out not to be a very effective politician. But am I right in saying that in some ways Australia has avoided some of the populism problems that we've had in Europe and the US?
Well, I would argue that the current Liberal leader, Dutton, I think he's giving it a pretty good go on the populist front. I think you're right about compulsory voting, though. And you remember when we interviewed Peter Malinauskas, the Premier of South Australia, and you see his idea, by the way, about banning social media for kids has now been. We said it was taken up by the federal government, and it's now actually it's going through. So that's a pretty big deal. But he made the point that he felt that what compulsory voting did was it forced the politicians to understand that most people, this is a point Dominic Sandbrook made on one of our live streams from New York, most people don't think that much about politics. So what the compulsory voting does is it means that you have all the people who, like you and me and lots of others, who think about politics all the time. You have loads of people who think a bit, and then you have loads of people who barely think about it until they get to an election. And lots of them in our country and in America don't vote. He says what compulsory voting does in Australia is it means that the politicians never forget that they're talking to all of those people. They're not just talking to a narrow group of people that might be their base or might just be the ones that they know are going to vote. And I think that does mean his view very much is that it means that it makes politicians much more rooted in the real world. And to be frank, most people want to live somewhere in the centre. They're not extremists in the main.
The only shock I had on compulsory voting, having been, as you say, very starry-eyed on it, is saying to a couple of people in Queensland, I stopped one person and said, "You've just had an election, haven't you?" And he said, "Really, have I?" And I said, "I thought you had compulsory voting." And he said, "Well, actually, the registration's not that tight up here." I was up in the Daintree.
Oh, Lord.
Then I met another person who was working on a road, and I said, "Have you just voted?" And he went, "Yeah, I just voted." And I said, "What do you think of the result?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't know there'd been a result." So I said, "What?" "What were you voting for?" And he said, "Well, I get fined if I don't vote." The fine is tiny; it's like 40, 50 quid, but everybody's trooping in to vote. But when I said what happens, he says, "Well, me and my mates, we just go in and we just play the numbers on the ballot paper."
I should say, by the way, it's just popped up. The last time we talked about Australia, I made a bad error.
Oh yes.
Well, do you remember I said that the map of, if you take Tasmania out, which is
Yeah.
Liberal, that the Queensland election
Yeah.
was the first state that had
Yeah.
gone non-Labor.
Yeah.
But in fact, Northern Territory had an election, which I'd forgotten about. So apologies, Northern Territory.